Hello, and welcome to the Biodiesel Magazine podcast. This is your host, Anna Simet. Hope all my listeners are doing well. This episode is brought to you by Paul Corporation. And today we have with us Fred Ghatala, President at Advanced Biofuels Canada. Fred, welcome, and thanks for chatting with us today.
All right. Glad to be here.
How about we have you start, Fred, by telling us a little bit about Advanced Biofuels Canada.
There's a great, polite, and independent country just north of the United States called Canada, and we are its trade association that represents advanced renewable fuels. So that includes biodiesel, renewable diesel, and all manner of low carbon fuels that reduce emissions and increase fuel selection and cost competitiveness. So we basically work in every province and federally that has a clean fuel policy in place or has the desire to do it. We all know renewable fuels and clean fuels exist because of strong, durable government policies. So we work to ensure that that is in place, that it continues, and that the renewable fuel sector continues to exist and thrive in Canada. We've got about 32 members. Our installed production capacity globally of all of our members is approximately 45 billion liters, and our members range from integrated oil and gas companies that have renewable fuel production assets, pure play biofuel producers, integrated agricultural companies, technology developers, feedstock suppliers, news organizations. We're a pretty big canvas. Our initial roots are as the Western Canada Biodiesel Association. So we absolutely love methyl esters, but our policies have expanded and so has our membership.
Okay, and how long have you guys been around, Fred?
We've been working in the sector since 2005. So it's been a dynamic 20 plus years in the sector, watching it grow, expand, and change.
I think that's a good segue into my next question. How would you characterize the state of Canada's advanced biofuel sector? And what does it look like, for capacity for ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel, et cetera?
Our sector in Canada reflects the global current state of affairs. I would call the global renewable fuel sector tenuous, with the great opportunity to expand. I said it's a policy-driven market. It is a policy-driven market in Canada. We're no different. We have about 2.1 billion liters of installed ethanol capacity, 2.5 billion liters of installed renewable diesel, about 500 million liters of biodiesel, and we have co-processing that also occurs. In sum, when you combine all of those different fuel types, the use side, we're about a 7 billion liter total market. The majority of that is fuel ethanol, simply because there's more gasoline car drivers than diesel in Canada, but we're about a 7 billion liter market and potential to expand. I'm optimistic about Canada's clean fuel market and production sector. It is just simply the case that policy in our industry has an inordinate impact on its viability, and where policies are in flux, like they are in flux all the time, really, that impacts our sector.
Mm-hmm. Right. So speaking of policy, you guys have the biofuels production incentive, which is new. Tell us about that and how it might help biodiesel or renewable diesel sector specifically.
The biofuels production incentive, the BPI, is a short-term measure put in place by the Canadian federal government to keep our biodiesel and renewable diesel producers competitive in our own domestic market because of 45Z incented imports that are able to come from the US and fully participate in our policies. So the BPI, because let's turn everything into an acronym, is a necessary measure to keep our producers operating and simply enduring so that we can manage and adjust to the shifting underlying fundamentals of going from a blender's tax credit in the US to an exportable producer's tax credit. This has been a tectonic shift across the North American renewable fuel sector. So the BPI incentive is a facility that will financially incent the production of biodiesel and renewable diesel per facility that's operating up to 300 million liters per year at a rate of 16 cents per liter for the first 170 million liters, and a step down to 10 cents for the remaining 130 million liters of production. That production needs to be from CUSMA, which is what you call the USMCA feedstocks. There are requirements also that the fuel stay in Canada. So it is very much focused on keeping our domestic producers domestically competitive. This is not a carbon intensity or emission rate based incentive like the 45Z is. And the rationale behind that is that the clean fuel regulations, which we'll talk about in a second, is a CI based policy. So there is already an incentive through increased credit creation for lower carbon intensity fuels.
How does the BPI interact with the clean fuel regulations?
The clean fuel regulations, that's the demand signal. So the CFR, the best way to describe it is as a national low carbon fuel standard plus plus. It's got a few additional measures that typical low carbon fuel standards do not contain. For example, it has the ability of co-processed fuels to participate in compliance category 1. Renewable fuels participate under compliance category 2, and fuel switching, that is EVs or gaseous fuels used in transportation, have the opportunity to participate in compliance category 3. It's a policy that took over 6 years to develop. It has been in place since June of 2022. The first debits were created by petroleum fuels in July of 2023. So we are underway with that policy. It is seasoning. We're in the first couple of compliance years of it. So the sector, both the obligated party, which are called primary suppliers under the regulation, are understanding how they properly plan compliance. The renewable fuel producers are increasingly understanding about how they get carbon intensity scores registered, how they comply with the material balance requirements, how they comply with the land use and biodiversity requirements. The land use and biodiversity requirements are something that is unique to the clean fuel regulations. They're basically operationalized sustainability requirements that require that fuels not be, of course, produced from feedstocks which are high indirect land use change risk, that do not are not derived from invasive species, and basically have a system. It utilizes a system of aggregate compliance similar to what's in place in the U.S. renewable fuel standard. In the modern day, it is very useful that there is such an agricultural friendly national renewable fuel policy like the CFR is. It is not a everything is good and everything can create compliance credits. It has some very real hurdles to make sure that only responsibly produced agricultural products and different feedstocks are eligible. We've got, in the last full published compliance year of information, we have about soybean derived renewable fuels participate. This is on the diesel side, because this is the biodiesel podcast. We've got soy-based renewable fuels at about 17%, canola-based at 29%, animal fats and used cooking oil at approximately 48%, and then 6% for other feedstocks, because there's lots of other niche and boutique type of feedstocks.
Thank you, Fred. Great answer. Hold that thought. A little bit more on policy. We're just going to take a real quick break for a few words from our sponsor. This episode of the Biodiesel Magazine podcast is brought to you by Paul Corporation, trusted by leading biofuel producers for 80 years.
When fouling, clogged filters, or co-processing inefficiencies start cutting into your margins, Paul's filtration experts can make all the difference. Their tailored studies pinpoint contamination challenges before they escalate, keeping your systems efficient and your operations running. Ready to solve what's slowing you down? Schedule a custom lab or field study with Paul. Visit paul.com to schedule.
All right, back at it. So, Fred, from early feedback, is the BPI influencing investment decisions or project timing for new biofuel facilities in Canada, or do you think it will in the future? Is it enough?
That's a great question. Probably the most important thing that the BPI does is signal that the biofuel sector, the renewable clean fuel sector, is important to the government of Canada, and they are very interested in maintaining its ongoing operations and ensuring that it can eventually expand. The BPI, as we've described it, is keeping the lights on. It is helping the sector go from survival to expansion. And for that reason, it's essential. Does the BPI itself likely result in increased capacity expansion? No. And that's because it's limited to existing operators of biodiesel and renewable diesel. Prime Minister Mark Carney's announcement on September 5th announced the biofuel production incentive as well as targeted amendments to the clean fuel regulation to ensure that renewable fuels are produced in Canada and from Canadian feedstocks like canola are competitive and viable in our domestic market. So the signal that the BPI is from the federal government that this is an important sector for many reasons is probably the most important thing about the BPI. Yes, it's a fiscal incentive that helps us compete against imports. It is not as big as the 45Z incentive is calculated to be on US renewable diesel and biodiesel producers. It is not fully, it doesn't fully make up that difference. So it's not viewed as a long-term measure. In fact, it's only a 2-year measure. And the understanding is that the CFR will be amended in very targeted ways prior to the BPI sunsetting on December 31st, 2027.
Okay, interesting. Great answer. Let's pivot just a bit and talk about feedstock. Feedstock availability, of course, is a growing concern here in the US and beyond, with sustainable aviation fuel coming into the picture too. What's the outlook in Canada?
Feedstock will always be an essential question with renewable fuel viability. Is there enough feedstock to support the continued growth of the sector? It's a question that gets always brought up when feedstock prices go up. Is the renewable fuel sector using too much feedstock? When prices are down, is the renewable fuel sector using enough feedstock? In Canada, and this is similar in the US, we've got major trade turbulence with some of our larger trading partners who have traditionally been some of the largest markets for using our canola, which is the primary agricultural feedstock that participates in our clean fuel market. So canola exports to China, which is our second largest market after the United States, were valued at $4.9 billion in 2024. The Prime Minister's recent visit to China seems to have created a path to reducing the tariff rate on canola seed imposed by the Chinese government so that canola will be flowing to those markets. So with renewable fuel policies in Canada and in the US, we are really getting back to basics of the reason why these policies are so useful is that they provide a domestic outlet, a domestic enduring source of demand for feedstock that is produced and processed domestically. This is the same as in the US. We are a very integrated market, but our inability to export canola to China and even the reduced 45Z incentive rates that are calculated on Canadian canola when it's processed into biofuels in the US That all indicates that we need firm domestic policy for using our domestic feedstocks in Canada. So we're really coming at the current BPI CFR amendments from the perspective of what does this do for sustained domestic agricultural demand? As you know, the biodiesel industry is inextricably linked with the agricultural supply chain to farmers. It's essential that this relationship endure. It's more than a relationship. I think that even undersells how important the renewable fuel and agriculture sectors are to one another and how having common approaches benefit everyone, because really it's a way of having ongoing domestic demand. And we, of course, food versus fuel will always be one of these issues that at least gets talked about at some point in high and low priced environments. It seems to be an enduring issue with renewable fuels, and I think justifiably so. Understanding food availability and having data backed answers and status on this on the relationship is essential. So the role of the renewable fuel sector in reinforcing our global food supply is extremely important. Material that can be used as food and fuel is very, very important.
Well said. Let's shift just a bit to cross-border trade. You referenced it a couple times already. As we know, it's long-shaped biodiesel markets. How are U.S. incentives, particularly when it comes to renewable diesel policy support, affecting Canadian producers?
Our domestic industry was created with the BTC, the Blender's Tax Credit, in place. So it was always the case that renewable fuels produced in Canada almost exclusively went to the United States. This is on biodiesel, the biodiesel side, went to the US where they could receive the Blender's Tax Credit, and our markets were filled by fuel produced in the US with the Blender's Tax Credit embedded in it that would come north to Canada, and consumers saved at the pump both ways. The shift to the 45Z PTC has certainly changed this. Other major markets, other major biodiesel markets like the European Union, who had a sector in place at the time of the BTC coming online. Of course, they have countervailing and anti-dumping approaches to maintain the competitiveness of their market. Canada did not do that because it really worked. It seemed to work for the fuel to flow in both directions. Canada is, on average, a bit colder than the United States. Having Canadian-produced biodiesel able to flow to warmer U.S. climates with the BTC seemed to work out for the industry, maintaining production levels because it could spread fuel to multiple markets. The change from the BTC to the 45Z PTC is certainly, that is a major update. The Inflation Reduction Act, when it was passed in August 2022, we all read it, and it has been since 2022, when our industry association and others have been noting with increasing volume to the Canadian government that when the clock strikes midnight, and it is 2025, the sector will be fundamentally different because of that tax credit change, and that Canada needs to respond, which is why we are now in the midst of our CFR amendments. The narrative is very understandable to policymakers. For the first time, really, in our renewable fuel history on the diesel side, we have Canadian feedstocks processed into renewable fuels in Canadian facilities and being used in support of Canadian renewable fuel policies. That is probably an outcome that is useful for future government policy and current government policy that's being updated to keep fully in focus, because it points to self-reliance. It points to the updated trading relationship between all countries, but especially among the USMCA participating jurisdictions. Canada needs to be increasingly responsible for creating policies that encourage Canadian fuel to be used in Canadian markets, and that's a strong statement. And I'll of course add right after that USMCA is an extremely important trade agreement, especially for agriculture, and so looking at the renewable fuel and energy and clean fuel policy approach in a North American lens is far more useful than us each going it alone.
Really well said. So, Fred, my last question for you is looking ahead 5 to 10 years, what does success look like for biodiesel and renewable diesel in Canada in terms of scale, market share, and policy stability?
That is a major question. I love ending on a crystal ball because it lets me admit that I'm a long-term optimist. I think we come out of this stronger than when we went into it. If we have Canadian policy that increasingly pulls on Canadian feedstocks grown on Canadian farms, that is a good thing. At the same time, if we have North American feedstock eligibility and we have fair trade in renewable fuel products between our countries, that sets us up for long-term success. We've got about 7% by volume use of renewables in diesel in Canada. There's a long way we can go. That's on average, right? The sky is very much the limit when it comes to how much renewable fuels we can get in the diesel pool. The numbers that California is achieving on the diesel side indicate that. British Columbia in the last full publicly reported compliance here was over 30% renewables in diesel. So we've got opportunity for growth and to take those higher levels of fuel blending and make those the norm. We'll need to ensure that we're always able to answer that feedstock availability question that Anna, you brought up a few minutes ago. So I think that we're in a very good position to endure and continue expanding, and that renewable fuel policy that's able to have a real domestic focus but remain absolutely open to trade is how we're going to get there. I didn't talk about SAF at all. If you let me just finish, because I did say sky is the limit, and SAF proves
sure.
100% that the sky is not the limit. Planes fly through the sky, and they need a lot of jet fuel to do it. So Canada and British Columbia have, the province of British Columbia on the west coast of Canada has the first jet fuel renewable content obligation in the Americas. The British Columbia Low Carbon Fuel Standard is a great example of why it is necessary to have a policy that has both a volume requirement as well as a carbon intensity reduction requirement. This year in 2026, we have a 2% carbon intensity reduction requirement on jet fuel that can be met through credits produced in the gas or diesel or aviation pool. But starting in 2028, there is a 1% blend requirement that's volumetric, that is including renewable jet fuel or sustainable aviation fuel, as it's commonly called. That grows to 3% in 2030. We think that structure is something that can be duplicated in other LCFS jurisdictions, including those on the U.S. Pacific Coast in New Mexico, who is the newest one, as well as work its way east across Canadian provincial policies. And we think that including jet fuel is a natural step for the clean fuel regulations and other policies like it. So we're all very excited about what aviation can do. One of the approaches that ABFC is taking is to ensure that this is net new demand and doesn't cannibalize existing on-road demand. So I think we're going to be using energy-dense liquid fuels for a long time, and renewable fuels shall be a growing part of that.
Well, thanks for looping SAF in, and I certainly look forward to following, progress in Canada. we'll have to have you on in a year and get an update from you.
Hey, that sounds good. And of course, we'll be, as you know, there's lots of conferences in this space.
Mm-hmm.
So, if any of you or your listeners are there, please come and say hello at the various clean fuels events that happen throughout the calendar. It'd be great to say hello.
Absolutely. Fred, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Very, very insightful and much appreciated.
All the best. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And to our listeners, thanks so much for tuning in. Be well and make sure you check out our past and upcoming episodes. Until next time.